Welcome, everyone, to Next Gen Talks, the Future of Policing video podcast series, hosted by the National Gen Z and Millennial community. Our conversation today is called Police Training on Trial. Do officers need more training, or is training not the answer? This conversation will unpack how police training or lack of police training has an impact on our communities. My name is Kim Parafina, and I am your conversation host. I'm currently in Seattle, Washington, and I'm a student at the University of Washington. Today, we have three wonderful guests joining me. Our first guest is the director of the Center for Criminal Justice Research and Training at California State University, Long Beach, Mr. Ron Mark.
Thank you for having me, Kim.
Our second guest is the executive director of the Institute for Criminal Justice Training Reform, Mr. Randy Shrewsbury.
Hi, Kim. Thank you.
And last but not least is the sociology professor and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College, Mr. Alex Vitale. Well, thank you all for joining us today to discuss this very important topic. Without further ado, we'll just get right into the first question. Why is there no national training standard for police officers in America? And anybody who would like to start, go ahead and jump in.
Well, I'll jump in to say I don't know because I was a police officer. Now, started my career almost 31 years ago, and so this was in '89, and we were talking about national standards then and the need for national standards. Now, I personally understand that. This can't be blanket standards, because I do believe that policing in California is different than policing in Utah, as an example, for some things. But when we talk about use of force, when we talk about like the prohibition of chokeholds or things like militarization of policing, I think that we can get guidance from the federal government. Unfortunately, I don't know that politically there's been a will to be able to do so. My hope is that, we since George Floyd's death, is that we're having a different conversation about policing in the United States, for which politicians themselves are able to kind of look at this more in an abstract view, other than just the tough on crime views, for which maybe there'll be more will from politicians to do so. What the exact standards are, I don't know, but I do think, especially relative to use of force, that having some federal guidance, also, of course, training minimums, I think could go a long way.
I see. What are your thoughts on that, Ron?
So to touch on top of that, I think that Randy is correct. It's more of a political issue than it is a law enforcement type issue. If you look at the way our Constitution was developed, and you look at, individual states' rights compared to the federal government. Now you throw in there, blue states, red states, local control, federal control. Federal government had a difficult time, over the years, enforcing a national speed limit. You're too young to remember that, but Randy and Alex may remember when that tried to go through, and they really didn't have the authority to do that. They withheld national highway funds to try to get people in compliance with that. So, there's some simple things like that to develop a national speed limit. Now you're talking about policing. That is a political question, and I don't know if we're ever going to get an answer to that. Yes, I agree with Randy. There's some things that should be standard throughout our nation when it comes to policing. Use of force would be a classic example of that, but getting the politicians and getting the states to buy into that and to acquiesce to one national standard, that would be the challenge of uniting this country. So good luck on that one.
It's really...
Yeah, I think, Ron's right. This is a political problem. It's not an accident that we have this radically decentralized model of policing with over 18,000 police departments in the United States. It's very different from Europe, Asia, most of the rest of the world that have some form of national police departments where they can centrally manage training, recruitment, assignments to specialized units, et cetera. And the fact is that political leaders at the local and state level are incredibly protective of that local control. And it allows them to frame policing around a set of missions that speak to local priorities. And so I think, the International Association of Chiefs of Police and the Police Executive Research Forum have tried to articulate some best practices and some national standards. But I think it's going to be a long time until we have some sort of federally mandated, national training requirements.
Well, I think you guys have all brought up very interesting points. Just to kind of follow up, do you think it's possible? Like, how should we change the national training standard for police officers if we can? Do you guys happen to have any recommendations, any thoughts on that? Or if you think this is something where it'll take a very long time to do and might not be possible in the next 10 years?
To answer that one, I think we're just not structured to do that. We couldn't get a national mask mandate, let alone, so it's very simple things like that. When the federal government says this is what we'd like to happen, individual states will oppose it, and we'll end up in the courts, and it'll get dragged on. But I think constitutionally, we were designed to not have a national police force. I think that's what our founding fathers, and I wasn't there, obviously, we aren't set up like other countries where we have just one national police force. So to get the political buy-in, I think would be the challenge. I don't see it happening in my lifetime. Kim, maybe that's going to be your next mission.
I'd like to just say for a moment that I don't want us to minimize the power that can be had on the state level. So our organization, one of the things that Alex just mentioned is that our organization recognizes that there's 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. And this is problematic in of itself, because then you have 18,000 different policies and procedures, hiring practices. But all of those, except with the exception of Hawaii, have a state training standards, normally called POST, the Peace Officer Standards and Training, that gives guidance. So our view of an organization is that while, of course, we would support some federal mandates from the federal level, being pragmatic to what Ron said, and I'm with Ron. I don't think that we're necessarily going to see it, certainly on the short term. Is that there is a lot of effort that can be made on the rules and regulations level. Even if we just look at policing as a labor standard, about how we can increase standards and tighten hiring practices that's distributed by the states.
I'll just add one last little historical note here. The reason that we have this constitution that emphasizes states' rights and decentralization, is tied to the defense of slavery in the South. And police in the South had a very different mission in some ways than police in the North, which was the management of slavery in places like Charleston and Savannah and New Orleans. And they certainly would never have agreed to any federal restrictions on their ability to use police to enforce slavery. And I think that, that legacy remains in place today. And so until we begin to have a kind of deeper reckoning with that history in the attempt to build more national unity, I think this is going to continue to be a problem. But I also agree with Randy that the creation of these state post standards has certainly helped, but we still see, huge disparities from state to state and big disparities in rural versus urban training requirements.
I see. Oh, man. Okay. Well, going back to Mr. Randy Shrewsbury, I read somewhere that you said when systemic failures occur at any organization, a logical approach to reform is to examine how employees were trained. Can you break down this quote and speak more to the systemic failures you've perceived in law enforcement training in America?
Sure. So I want to speak in detail about that, but I'm going to steal a little bit of Alex's thunder and also promote his great book, The End of Policing. I think that first, critically, what we need to do is reduce the footprint for which policing is in our society. It's my view that we're over policed. We have police officers in schools, and the war on drugs has been an abysmal failure. We've criminalized poverty to degrees, regarding homelessness and panhandling and that sort of thing. So I think that there is a reckoning of prioritization that we need to have with policing. But that being said, is that I also believe that there is a functioning role for law enforcement in our community or in our country, especially relative. Especially on the short term, as we fix or hope to fix some societal woes about poverty and mental health and gun control, those kinds of things. And that's going to leave behind a necessity for policing in the U.S. So I would like to start off first to say that it's our position that the police just don't receive enough training, just as a basic mandate. If we compare policing standards to many other professions with far less responsibility, far less of consequence for their actions, is that we see far more training standards. Cosmetology is the one that most people kind of point to, that we've been talking about for several years now. In every state in the United States, in every single state in the U.S., cosmetologists are required more training than the police. This is, as a labor standard. This is as a minimum. But then we can add in teachers and healthcare workers, massage therapists in some states. All have this higher standard that just doesn't match what the responsibilities of policing is. Second is that when we look internationally at what our counterparts are doing in, especially in other Western cultures, but in over 110 nations that we've looked at, we've only found 3 countries that have less training standards than the United States, and that's Iraq, Afghanistan, 2 of which we've trained, and Papua New Guinea. Most other countries pretty exclusively see this as a 2-year, 3-year, 4-year program. There's even a couple of countries that have a 5-year program and one that has a 6-year program. I don't know if that's necessary, but certainly 6 to 8 months just isn't adequate. And then the next thing that I would say is what we are having officers focus on. I feel like that there is an imbalance of training emphasis on tactical issues. Now, understand for sure, when an officer is injured or killed, we need to do whatever we can to ensure that doesn't happen again. There's no question to that, and I applaud what the police have done over the years to ensure that officers remain safe, and it's a pretty safe profession, even relative to homicide on the job. There's many professions where you're more likely to be murdered on the job than a police officer. But that being said, is it can't be done at the expense of what I would call hyper use of force or excessive use of force, where officers are acting faster in a belief because there is a possibility that they could be injured, instead of reacting to a probability that an event is going to occur. And I think that starts at training. We know that our studies are showing that the closer that an officer is to their training, the more likely that they are to be involved in a deadly use of force incident. Yet the further that they're away from their training, the more likely that they're going to be killed in the line of duty. So it's our position that this is about imbalance that needs to be focused on. So those are the key things. There's a bunch more, but those are the key things that we believe that that we have a failure in the current system.
I see. Ron, do you happen to have any thoughts or any feedback on what Randy just said?
I think Randy's correct. I don't think I think training is imbalanced throughout our country, the amount of training we give, and I think it is inadequate. We should give more training. What we're talking about, though, is exactly that is how much are we willing to pay for it and how are we going to structure that? It's not as easy as people think when it comes to training law enforcement. That's one of the things that our center does. And you're dealing with different size agencies. You're dealing with agencies that have personnel shortages, getting people to training, the required types of training. Law enforcement has become a dumping ground for things that society doesn't want to deal with. When you talk about dealing with the mentally ill and people that need assistance in this country, it's become a law enforcement issue, and it should never have been a law enforcement issue. This is a social issue, but we refuse to take that on. We refuse to talk about that or come to a solution. You can't take all the people that were at one time housed and say, well, you shouldn't be here anymore, and throw them out on the street. And now say somebody deal with them, find a psychologist, find social workers that are willing to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at 3:00 in the morning to respond to these kind of incidences. It's those types of things that, we're asking our law enforcement officers to do, and then we're criticizing them for trying to do it and not giving the amount of training they need to do that. So, it's easy to point blame. Law enforcement has always been the tip of the spear, so to speak, because they represent government. But there's money out there, and those of us that have worked in government know about waste, and money can be allocated. I don't think it's about defunding the police. I think that's a diversive statement that I personally don't like to hear. You automatically get people defensive when you start saying things like that, whether you're in law enforcement or not. But I do think we need some restructuring, and I do think that we need to put some money into some of our social work. We need to, we've defunded a lot of those things. We've defunded a lot of what our communities are responsible for. City of Los Angeles, for instance, has been dealing with the homeless issue for dozens and dozens of years, and every politician that comes in says they're going to do something about it, but it never changes. So, where does the true problem lie? And it's a lot further up the food chain.
And if I may just jump in, sorry, I just want to jump in because Mark made a good point about defunding the police and the mantra relative to defunding. I personally like reallocate the police, but police funding, but it doesn't have as strong of a saying. But what Ron pointed out is really true, because what happens is that when there is budget cuts, very often the training division is really, really early on the chopping block. And so one of the things that we recognize is, when we're asked the question, why is it that cosmetologists are required, a year and a half to 2 years of training for which a police officer is, maybe 8 months of training, why is there the imbalance? And I mean, there's a couple of things, but one of the very obvious one is exactly what Ron talked about, is about the will to be able to have politicians assigning this money as a line item budget to increase spending and training. However, it's our view that as a long-term goal is that we need to decouple police training from the state altogether. And I'll give an example. If I went to work at the district attorney's office, which is an arm of law enforcement, right? The DA's office is not going to send me to get my undergrad. They're not going to send me to get my law degree. I got to go to college. I got to go to law school. And then when I'm done, then I can apply to become a DA and a law enforcement entity. Now, if we remove the burden from the state to have to finance the expansion of basic training, then we can look at it objectively and say, okay, the students, are going to be responsible for it. We have, some incentive programs, that sort of things, because not everyone, would be able to afford. There would obviously be some pushback relative to recruitment. But I also think that it would elevate the profession for which that is going to counter, some of the folks who may fall off in the current system as it is. But until we move it away from the state, then I honestly believe that we're only going to be kind of cutting around the margins about the increase of training. One of the things we've also looked at is over the last 20 years, increases of training on average is only about 10 hours a year. In each state. So we're never really going to get to where we need to be unless someone else picks up the tab. And my view is it needs to be shifted to higher education.
I see.
Well, that's certainly the way, job training for all professions is going. It's being offloaded on students to finance their own training in educational institutions, and then come to the employer already trained, which has been criticized by unions and some other groups. But and Randy, thanks for the shout out. It is much appreciated. My concern is that I don't think we have strong evidence that additional better training is going to make a huge difference until we shrink this footprint of policing, and shrink it pretty significantly. As long as the elected officials, and I agree completely with Ron that police officers are put between a rock and a hard place. And that we have to look up the food chain, because our elected officials have told the police not only to be in charge of school discipline and managing homelessness and dealing with mental health response, but also are telling them to wage a war on drugs and a war on terror and a war on crime and a war on gangs. And these missions require contradictory approaches. And then we tell officers to make split-second decisions about where to adjust the dial on which training they're supposed to use. And I think if we dramatically reduce the scope of policing to those things where we can't figure out a nonviolent, non-coercive oriented solution, then we could have, I think, a much more productive and robust conversation about how to completely transform policing, whether it's through an expanded academy approach or something that is, privatized and decentralized. I mean, I'm open to that conversation. I just really, when we look at the infrastructure of training that exists today, the people doing the training, the mission of the training, it's hard to see how making some incremental changes in that is going to change what really happens on the ground in policing, given the political pressure to get rid of that homeless campment, get those kids off that street corner. As long as those imperatives remain, we're going to produce some of this problematic behavior in policing.
So what do you think?
That should stimulate a response, I would think, from our other panelists here.
Yes, you guys can go ahead.
So, if I can, so essentially then we have to admit as a society, our social services system has failed. It's our homeless issue, our underserved communities, we failed in a lot of different ways. Once we do that and rebuild those systems, we can reduce the footprint of law enforcement. They should not be having to deal with the homeless population. There are better ways and better ways to intervene with youth programs, but those take funding, and the politicians are going to have to do that. Speaking what Randy and expanding on what he talked about of expanding law enforcement training right now as a budget line item is a drop in the bucket. Our states do not spend that much money on that. If you look at compared to other things that the states spend on, it's nothing. It could easily be increased, and whether there's some empirical evidence whether it will produce better law enforcement officers, reduce death, reduce uses of force. We won't know until we try. It's just a matter of which direction we want to take on first.
Well, and if I may jump in, Alex makes an argument that's difficult to push back on because, and just as Ron said as well, is that we're dealing with societal issues that are asked to be fixed in the criminal justice system that for which the two really don't match up. In 1989, a old Cincinnati captain who was an academy commander said to me or to our class, he said, whatever illusions you have about policing, let me correct it He said, what you do is you deal with the 3 Ds, the drunk, the drugged, and the deranged. Now, calling someone with mental health issues deranged, I understand is, not politically correct. It was a long time ago. But the advice that he gave, there was no other depiction that was more accurate in my experience. 16 years on, 15 years in policing, 16 years working in police departments, even another 15 in the private sector, in the justice system. There's nothing that has been more accurate to that. But one of the things that even me as a young person then, the very first thing that popped in my head is that that's fixable, right? These are issues that are fixable. We can have social programs. And I was far more conservative in those days than where I find myself today, and still recognize that we're talking about issues that are deep rooted into society. We're talking about root causes of criminality, or the responsibilities, as Ron talked about, that we just keep dumping on the police to fix. We know that in the 1980s, mental health centers across state mental health centers were defunded across the United States by the Reagan administration. And then all of a sudden now, we've just shifted from medical care facilities and put them in jail. But to Alex's point is that I agree with you that if we just clip around the edges to this, we're not really going to see any difference. Our organization is right now studying if there is a difference between, like, Connecticut, who has the highest standards, versus Louisiana, Oregon, that has among the lowest. I mean, there's a lot to consider because demographics are different. But we're studying that now to see if there's much of a difference. There's a few things that are kind of popping up that we're seeing early, but I agree with Alex that we've got to be talking about fundamental differences in how we're training the officers. I say regularly, if we train officers like soldiers, and we dress them like soldiers, and we equip them like soldiers, then we should never be surprised that they act like soldiers. And that's what we've shifted to over the last 25, 30 years. There's a great book, The Rise of the Warrior Cop, by Radley Balco, who outlines, this rise of militarization and policing. I think that there has to be a greater focus on officers understanding, number one, the historical role that policing has had in our country. Exactly, what Alex mentioned earlier about their roles as, slave catchers, their roles in labor fights in the early turn of the 20th century, all the way Jim Crow, civil rights movements, all the way to today. Someone posed the question of, if I steal $50 from my employer, they call the police. If the employer steals from me, it's a civil matter, right? So this is defining what we've relied on police as a function is, and I think that through some levels of increases in training and refocus in training, we can hit at some of it. But I don't disagree that we have to have some fundamental reprioritization in our country before a lot of these things are going to be fixed.
Can I ask you guys a question? Because you're closer to the ground on this than I am. And I showed my class the documentary, I believe it's Do Not Resist is the title, about police militarization. And in this, you see examples of some of the most extreme of this kind of shoot first mindset of officer safety training. And there are a lot of people giving this kind of training around the country to police departments, to SWAT teams, to all the rest, including, some really toxic ideology about the world and the function of police in society. And this is something that's completely under the control of local police departments. It doesn't require any shift in funding one way or the other, that we could just get rid of those people from police training. And yet they persist. So do you have a sense of the willingness of the police to actually take this issue on, and what the impediments are to doing so?
So Alex, that's a kind of a political issue. We use some of those examples in some of our classes when we teach also. We use a slide of a sheriff's department in another state that the sheriff thought it was a good idea to paint the Punisher logo on the front of their police cars. But a sheriff's an elected official. Eventually it was removed, but how do you impact that? How do you create a standard that says, no, that's not acceptable? Now in this state, I guarantee you that's not acceptable, but in other states it is. And we've watched videos that other political officials, some law enforcement, some outside have made some very different comments. I mean, I believe still there's other parts of this country that still teach about the War of Northern Aggression. That when I say that in classes, people laugh, and I said, go look at some history books. There's history books that talk about the War of Northern Aggression. And I told that to my kids, and they said, in their college students, what are you talking about? I said, I'm talking about the Civil War that other people have relabeled. So this is a deep societal issue. We're a very divisive country right now. I think public service is a noble profession, doesn't matter what it is. And when I get into these discussions with a lot of our college students, I ask them, what have you done to make this a better place? Whether it's your city, your state, your country, what have you given up to make this a better place? And when I see blank stares on my faces, I worry. But so I don't know. So that's a long answer to your question of how do we impact that? It's deeper than that. It's almost really a failure of our educational system in some aspects. And Alex, in college, I'm sure you see that when you have students coming through that they can barely read and write. And how do they get there? And where are we passing them on to? And these are the people that are going to make decisions for us in the future. I worry.
I do have an answer to this, Alex, on some level, and Ron, with all respect, I slightly disagree that this is political. I think this is administrative. Is in that same documentary that Alex is mentioning is one of these independent trainers who, incidentally, has trained more police officers as an individual in the United States than any other person, for which he advocates killing first, asking questions later. In the documentary, he tells the students that if they kill someone, to rush home and have sex with their partner because it will be the best sex that they ever have. We've seen recently that there was training in the same style of training in Kentucky that quoted Hitler and Stalin. I think that this is where police chiefs and sheriffs and county commissioners and mayors can put a foot down to say, our officers will not attend this kind of training, period. Now, it does raise a little bit of debate because Minneapolis, as an example, they banded what is called this warrior style training. And the police union stepped up and said, fine, if the city won't provide it for you, then we'll do it for you, as a training mechanism. I think that I think that if we can prohibit facial hair on police officers, or how long their hair is on, or what uniforms that they're wearing, we can prohibit training that advocates the wholesale killing of people. I also believe that this is a grassroots issue as well. And it's why our organization is a little bit different. While we do research that's similar to like maybe PERF or the Chiefs Association or the Institute of Police, we're also a grassroots organization because we understand that there has to be pressure that is applied. So one of our goals is that when we have one of these type of trainings that are showing up in our communities, that we have folks from the community demanding that it end. But I would like to say one other thing, because this is a broader issue about militarization, and I think that it's where we have to examine how militaristic talk is just ingrained inside of policing, right? We call We call them platoons, right? Orange County, I believe, has tactical warfare training, right? I mean, as Alex mentioned, we have a war on drugs, we have a war on crime, we have a war on terror. Once again, we are inundating these guys into believing that they are soldiers residing inside of the United States as an occupying force, which then in turn makes each one of us possible enemy combatants. And when you view the public that way, it's my contention is that then you're going to have officers making decisions based on the belief that they are in this war versus being guardians of safety. I, as for one, I mean, George Floyd's case is a little bit different. But largely speaking, I don't like looking at individual officers and their behaviors in a lot of these instances, because I believe that they're acting exactly of what the culture is promoting and what they're training to do. So I view this as a much larger structural issue of asking, are they a military? Are they at war? And if not, then why are we continuing to use this language and hiring outside people to come in and teach, warlike tactics?
Oh, got quiet. Randy, I don't think we're on different page. Well, you call it an administrative decision, but I think those administrative decisions are guided by the political decisions that are made. And
fair enough.
Chiefs, sheriffs are very political individuals. Here in California, we're averaging about 2-3 years now on police chiefs. They're just not lasting. I can't speak for other states, but I know post-training really emphasizes not the warrior mindset, but the guardian mindset. It's taught in many, many classes. It's part of curriculum that you can look up on the Post website. But the term guardian mindset is first and foremost. But I can't speak for other parts of our country. And I know it's different, and I'm not making excuses for them, but there are challenges. I met a deputy sheriff from Oahu they guard our airports flying into Hawaii, and he's got a wife and 3 kids, and with his salary, he qualifies for food stamps, which is not right.
Well, I mean, I would argue that's separate. I don't disagree with you. I mean, but I think that there are many professions in our society that are undervalued. My son actually is a teacher who's attending Cal State Long Beach. He'll be finishing his PhD in about 3 weeks.
Nice.
But I want to talk just a little bit like what you mentioned about California as an example. I'm here in Los Angeles. If we look at advanced training in that Post signs off on, there's about 1,100 programs, anywhere from investigations to traffic enforcement, drug recognition, homicide detective, on and on and on. There's only one program outside of basic training that lasts longer than 2 weeks. Only one program out of all of these things, and that's SWAT training. So this is what I'm talking about, prioritization. When we look at policing, right, that has 40% of homicides are unsolved. Since 1969, there's 500,000 unsolved homicides. Chicago PD released recently that only 5% of sexual assault cases were solved. And what someone has sat down and said, you know what? 2 weeks of training is fine for this to become a detective. But if it's a SWAT officer, if it's someone that we're teaching to use force, then that's got to be a month-long training. So this is what I mean by, part of the imbalance is for sure in basic training, but it extends throughout the career. When we talk about continued education, the vast majority of continued education in most states, not all states, but goes to use of force. It goes to requalifications of weapons. Is that important? Of course it is. But there has to be a balance as well to these other really, really critical topics that that police are just kind of brushing over, or the trainers are brushing over for the officers.
And
just to kind of, sorry about cutting you off, Alex, but just to kind of jump in here, I understand, and this is a very insightful conversation that kind of shows how deep this issue really is. I myself didn't realize how much of our history goes back into this, and then you guys even mentioned the educational system. However, this is still a problem, and it's definitely a problem that we all live in our reality right now. And I understand that it is a very hard issue to actually solve. I think you guys are right that it'll take a while to solve. However, what can we do about it right now? Like, what types of training should police departments focus on so that we have less police violence in Black and Brown communities?
Well, I think, I agree with Ron. This is mostly a political problem. When we look at some of the worst examples of the kind of training that they receive. And it's not about the volume of training by itself, right? Because we don't need more of the bad training. And the post-training is obviously got a lot of advantages to it, but then departments are supplementing that with these side trainings, which sometimes are like diametrically undercutting what they're learning in the post-training by sending them, for instance, to these SWAT camps and bringing in, close quarters battle training and things like that. And so I do think there has to be a conversation about political accountability here. Local sheriffs are elected, and that is, I think, where the worst abuses happen. There are efforts to try to do some political accountability there. My friend Jessica Pishko runs a newsletter now that's trying to raise awareness about the role of these elected sheriffs, just like we've seen this increased awareness about the role of prosecutors that led to this progressive prosecutor movement, where people are using the ballot box to take back control over these abusive prosecutorial systems that we've seen in too many places. And I think we need a similar kind of movement around sheriffs, though it will be difficult because many of these sheriffs are in rural places with very conservative voter bases. But there's also a problem in the big cities. The big cities are often better, but not always. And they're very insular, and there's no transparency often. So you can have a big city, progressive Democratic mayor who has just turned training over to the police department, and no one in city government and no one in the community has any idea what's going on in the police academy. And that's got to change. We got to open the door. Maybe some of the outsourcing that Randy's suggesting would at least provide more of that transparency and public accountability if we were doing it in, local community colleges and public universities and involving civilian faculty. The problem is when we leave the training entirely up to the police and former military, we lose that crucial civilian accountability. So that would be one of the places that I would start.
Thank you. Ron, Randy, do you happen to have any thoughts on this?
Again, I can only speak for our state, and that is, as they both talked about, that's one of the big problems. Is it is different for every single state. Yeah. Randy, there are longer programs here for advanced officer training. Post has a course called SBSLI. It's a leadership institute. It's 8 months worth of training for sergeants, and being in law enforcement, that's a critical rank. It's a critical level in every agency. They are the supervisors. They're the boots on the ground that are ensuring that there's a good balance that's placed out there. It's a very intensive program. It's one of Post's flagship programs. But again, you're dealing with a state with over 80,000 law enforcement officers. We're really 3 states rolled into one, and that's one of the things I discovered training here in the state. It's very diverse, from rural areas to big cities. Training is great, and we'd love to get our people to more training, but then we run into funding issues. We run into staffing issues. The list goes on and on. Just saying, hey, this is a great training, everybody should go to it. It's not that easy to do. When you've got a department of 25, 30 officers and you want to train everybody on that agency, how do you get them to that training when the closest site is 150 miles away? What's your training budget look like to try to send somebody out there or send somebody to that agency? You got to pull people off shift. You have to backfill them with overtime. The logistics really people don't think about, and it's a bigger problem than you would think when it comes to training. Post is a small agency. It's a regulatory agency. They have maybe 150 employees there for the entire state of California, and that's an awful lot. Dealing with just the minimum regulations. Some states, I believe Washington is one that has a single police academy. Is that correct, right? California has over 45. And so those there alone becomes problems, and it becomes a problematic issue. And I wish I had an easy solution to that. I could probably retire with that if I had that answer.
And thank you for correcting about the class. Here's what my response is, and by the way, I understand what you're talking about, especially when we're looking at smaller agencies. The very first department I started with, there was 5 of us. My sergeant was also the school bus driver, so I know what it meant for one officer to have to be off that day to go attend training, because that meant that you were paying overtime to someone else to sit in their spot. But what do nurses do? What do doctors do? What do law firms do? It seems as if that every other profession recognizes, and I agree that, this is talking about the issue of politics, of where politicians have to be affording the budgets in order for this to do this. We can't just say, well, okay, look, there's, and this is, something we could talk an entire hour on, but there's 37 states in the United States that allow the police to work with full power, with autonomy, with the powers of arrest and the powers of using deadly force before they attend the academy. California used to be one up until the early 1970s, but Hawaii has no state mandate whatsoever that a police officer is trained. In Maui and Honolulu, those departments do. But the idea that a police officer can go work, it's on average about a year before they attend training. Number one, it says something about the training, right? If they're able to function a year and they did okay, then we might want to be examining the training. But the argument is always exactly, kind of what Ron is rightfully pointing out is that if I'm in a department of 10 people, but by the way, I think half of the 18,000 is departments less than, I think, 20 people or 30 people maybe. But if I lose an officer, that is going to be an enormous expense to the state, to the agency, because that means they have to pay overtime until they get that role filled. Small agencies have struggles. They don't have recruitment power, right? I can go to LAPD and start out at, 65,000. I don't know if that's what they start out with, but, much better than, some small town in San Bernardino or something. But this is, in my view, this argument has just been, is circular, where we just keep saying, well, okay, I understand, yes, that training is expensive. Yes, it is. It will wreak havoc on our payroll budget if we have to pay overtime. But I go back to, well, there's lots of professions that there's issues. There's huge nursing shortages, but we don't have nurses. We don't go to the hospital and a nurse says, I'm going to training next year. I know that all three of us have been circling back over and over and over about that this is political. And it's because, to Ron's point earlier, right, the mayor is the chief law enforcement officer of the city, right? I mean, he's the police chief's boss. The council has to be held to account. Sheriffs have to be held to account to what their hiring practices are and what their training practices are, and making sure that they have the funding in order to be able to make the expansions, or at least even meet the minimums that are needed.
And I know that there are some chiefs, there's some agencies that would love to help push in that direction to solve those problems is by regionalization, right? You regionalize a group of smaller cities, you cut back on your expenses, it gives you a larger workforce so you can afford better training, better equipment. But where they stopped, the individual cities, the politicians want local control, and they're not willing to give up that local control. And law enforcement was a push years back just to regionalize communication centers, and that's become a very effective way to reduce costs and solve some of these problems. But a lot of cities won't regionalize, and because of that, it's just another point to why when I roll back on this, it's somebody. You're right about nurses. Law enforcement could do it if somebody's willing to write the check and afford that training. But now we're in the era where the battle cry is defund the police, and politicians are afraid to put any more money toward a police department. So we're in this vicious circle of we have to have the police. We're afraid to fund them, but we're going to ask them to do more. And I don't know. Hopefully you two have an answer for that one and we can dig ourselves out. So
I certainly don't think we should be asking them to do more, right? I mean, that's the issue. So I think you're right that you can't solve it with the existing calculation. So we got to change the calculation. So if we really think that there's a need for additional resources for training, not just fixing the training resources that we already have, my view, and I think this is the view of the movement for Black Lives, who I'm in pretty regular conversation with, is that, let's start reducing that scope of policing. Let's get them out of the mental health business and out of the schools, and then you're going to free up officers. I mean, I just keep thinking about, the small town with 5 officers, what exactly are people doing? These towns with 2 officers, right,
Alex,
who refuse to regionalize, what are they doing?
I hate to interrupt. This is a really important conversation. However, we are reaching that 1 hour mark. I wanted to make sure that you guys had everything you wanted to say before we wrap up. However, this is all the time we have for this episode of the Next Gen Talks, the Future of Policing video podcast series. Before we go, I'd really like to thank you all so much, to Ron, to Randy, and for Alex for joining us. And thank you for everyone out there watching. We hope you learned as much as we did, and that this shows that this problem involves much more than the police, involves a greater scope of people, and we would need a lot of more people to help solve this problem. And that this isn't just a problem for the police. To wrap up this interview, I'd like to just give our guests one more question. And if you guys were to give one sentence of what you'd like our viewers to get out of this, please give them now.
I just think that, the policing is not going to get better until we dramatically change the scope of what's being asked of them.
I see. Ron?
I would agree with that. I think, but we're looking at, like we've talked about, this is a societal issue. There's a lot more pieces to this puzzle that really need to be addressed first before we can get down to, the role of law enforcement in our communities. So I thank you very much.
And Randy?
My short answer would be get involved, educate yourself as much as possible about what the issues are, attend town halls, demand accountability from the leaders, stand up with new ideas and innovative ways of fixing these problems.
Well, as you all have heard today, we hope that this conversation inspires you, and that everyone here watching, please continue to just this dialogue or these important conversations like these. And please don't be afraid to ask questions and ask officials and ask your professors on what we should do, is because there's so many perspectives out there. There's so many perspectives that need to be taken into consideration. And I think you will need all these perspectives in order to find a very conclusive solution. Thank you all.